the origins of this panel are in some research that Dick and I were doing. We were kind of investigating the deep background, the culture of innovation and so forth that went behind Internet 1. And one of the things we kept tripping over was a cultural dynamic that we began to call stewards versus creators. And at first it was just sort of a shorthand, and then after a while, as we would mention it to more and more people, we discovered that it seemed to resonate. Now let me first, I've got 4 panel members, and I want to quickly introduce them because I'm going to put them on the spot a little bit. They've had some briefing, but not a lot of briefing on what we're going to talk about. They all have particular reasons to know about this problem, to have insight into it. So we have Ron Howell, who is with the Washington Research Foundation with a venture capital background. So we would expect, although not necessarily, a steward perspective from a venture capitalist. Karen Brown is a faculty member at the University of Washington, a business school professor with an expertise in project management. She's writing a book on it right now. We look to her in part, in addition to everything else she might offer, she knows what enlightened project management looks like. So we're going to talk about how we manage some of the problems with stewards and creators on projects. We have Frank Coker, who is currently in his latest gig, a consultant mostly, but is also a serial entrepreneur, has done a lot of different things, and will, I hope, represent the creator perspective to some degree. And we have Jonathan Roberts, who is also a venture capital person, partner with Ignition Partners. So let me just sort of start by welcoming these guys. So if we give them a quick round. So the CEO is looking at a make or break deadline. This is an IT consulting company, about 60 people, on its way to getting bigger, working for a major financial services client. If this goes well, there will be much more business. There will be, this will be a much bigger company. There will be riches and all sorts of acclaim for the people involved in the company. But it all hinges on this deadline. And it was pretty clear from conversation with the client that missing the deadline was not going to be acceptable, that there was going to be a real downside to missing this deadline. And in the midst of this, so of course the CEO took a lot of interest in this situation, decided to take off whatever other hat she was wearing and mainly support this project team. So she was bringing them coffee, she was doing anything they needed to do. She would have been coding herself if she had thought she would be helpful in that capacity. In the process of this, in talking to her top developer, she discovered something that surprised her and alarmed her. She discovered that her top developer had been spending time coding something not related to the project at all. And he was doing this while they were trying to make this deadline. Now, this was upsetting and appalling to the CEO, but this was her very best developer. And so it posed something of a difficulty for her. And this is where I want to start. I want to kind of start by asking each of you, and we'll talk about the general problem at length later. But just quick thoughts on this. What do you do with a situation like this? Have you seen a situation like this? What do you think? Anybody?
Well, you know, I've got a situation that's a whole lot like this in a little startup that I'm launching right now, where one of my star players is a former Amazon employee who wants to really be a musician. And he quit Amazon, and now he's working for me like 20 to 30 hours a week. And what a deal I have. But I got to be willing to let this guy go on the road and disappear for a couple weeks at a time, go record CDs. But he does great work. So, you know, it's an opportunity.
So with this guy, you're kind of okay with it?
Definitely okay with it. But, you know, you got to have probably some boundaries where you say, you know, if this guy's straying beyond what's legal, or if it's going to damage the image of my company, or, you know, really be hazardous to the health of the rest of the company, then you have to draw a line.
Yeah, I worked at Microsoft for 13 years and had a chance to work on a lot of the great businesses there. And while there, I sort of developed the notion of a tax. And at the core of every product, you know, Windows 3.0 is a guy named David Weiss that figured out virtual memory. Dave Cutler is behind Windows NT. And these guys, no offense to them, but they're all kind of a little odd. I actually serve on the board with a board with Vint Cerf, who has his own sort of inspired peculiarities. And so I've sort of developed this notion that you can extract a tax that's in direct relation to your contribution. And so if you're the core of a product, you can extract a pretty high tax. And you've got to isolate it from the rest of the team. And I've had occasional meetings with people where I've said, your tax is getting a little high. So
that might
back
be the
off
reasonable response here, to sort of have this, your tax is getting a little high conversation with the guy. It's a conversation, though. You're not going to threaten to fire him. Yeah?
No, because you would be crazy.
And it's not a credible threat.
It's not a credible threat.
Yeah. Thoughts?
I haven't had exactly that situation, but very close, where the engineers were rebelling against management that kind of thought making and selling a product was important. The way in which you phrase the scenario, or at least the way I understand it, is that this person is truly indispensable. And if that's true, then they're indispensable, which means you can't fire them. But hopefully they're not completely irrational, and the first approach, I think, of reasonable management is to have that conversation. I like the concept of, your tax is getting high, but it's the air, water, food drill, and right now, we're low on air. You've got to redeploy, otherwise we're dead in the water.
So points to anybody in this 2 days who first uses the phrase, your tax is getting high, all right? Karen, thoughts?
Yeah, I would just add something from a project management standpoint. One of the things that interests me about, or impresses me about effective project managers, is their ability to find out what interests members of the team. And it seems to me there's something uninteresting about this project for this guy. And maybe he wasn't the right guy for the project, or maybe she just has to appreciate that people can work on something only so long before they need to have some other food or water besides the air. And but that finding out what interests people is a really key starting point, I think.
When we use this case at the Harvard Business School, we sometimes have executives recommending firing the guy. Now, often they recommend waiting till the project deadline is met and then firing the guy. In fact, what the CEO did was she had a conversation, which I think probably is reasonably approximated by your tax is getting high. And they sort of did some readjustment for a while the project was underway. And far from firing the guy, she actually, believe it or not, she married him.
That's a compromise.
So that's kind of a little side story, but yeah. So they really got some communication in place. Yeah.
How's that in project management?
Yeah. Draw your own conclusions. Yeah. No. The other story that's in the paper, and I won't belabor it because I think you've all read it, which gives us the sort of dark side of getting too tough with this kind of thing, is the story about Sun, where it looked like they were playing around with a video game in 1993, and it turned out to be the key technology that the whole strategy of the company was rearranged around. I'm just going to give you a few findings from this research. One of the things Dick and I did is spend a fair amount of time interviewing some of the original internet pioneers. And we got I think we were surprised by the results in many cases. But it caused us, because we kept tripping over this cultural dynamic, it caused us to generate this notion of what we might call stewards and creators. And let me just spend a moment defining or making clearer what we mean by this. And these, by the way, this is partly something we submit as a suggested taxonomy. If there are subcategories, if we've got the categories wrong, we'd love to hear about that. We're going to come to a point a little bit later when we do open this up for everybody. But basically, the steward is doing his or her very best to execute professional responsibility of a manager, spending someone else's money. doing their very best not to spend money beyond the point where it earns commensurate return. So the point of diminishing returns is a very big deal for these guys. You don't want to go beyond break even because that would be wasteful. That means you're going to seek products that are good enough that we can sell. One of the cases we have at the Harvard Business School is called Delamere Vineyards, and it's about a guy who's a chemical engineer who quits his job as a chemical engineer, buys land in Australia, and sets out to make a great wine. And one of the things that drives one of my colleagues who loves wine crazy is our MBA students don't really see the point in making a great wine, right? The point they see is making a pretty good wine that they can get a good margin on, right? And so it's a mindset. And every year I can tell when he's taught this case because he comes back to class with his head down and he's kind of dragging because he truly loves wine. But we believe in compromise if we're a steward. We're a value harvester primarily. We're very interested, as Ed was talking about before, in whether we can actually capture the value associated with an innovation. It doesn't do us a great deal if we're a steward, of good if we're a steward to create the value if we cannot capture it. Creators, on the other hand, and we encountered a lot of this impulse, don't really know where the point of diminishing return is and frankly don't really care. They're mostly chasing a great vision. They think something's cool. They're not even sure that they don't even necessarily perceive the opportunity in business terms. They may be chasing something that's just a lot of fun or something that they think is important for humankind. They seek the grand vision of it. A compromise is not something that they want to make, and therefore this is part of the reason that we end up with conflict. And this person is mostly worried about value creation. Capture is somebody else's problem, right? Just to sort of give you some samples of what we heard when we did these interviews, and these are from quite notable people. The creator, Doug Engelbart, says, what if you can he's talking about, he was giving us the retrospective on what motivated him to do what he did, and of course, he and his team were responsible for a great deal of what we now call GUI interfaces. He says, what if I can maximize the value of my career and help humankind? You have to have a crusade. And he wanted to augment human capabilities. He was not shooting low. He looked around him, he saw a world that was increasingly complex and troubled, and he wanted computers to be something that would increase human capability to deal with that complexity and those troubles. So he was not aiming low. Licklider and Taylor wanted to create entirely new modes of creative interaction. For the creators, to compromise is equal to failure. And it was remarkable, probably one of the most remarkable moments in all of the interviews that we did was when we were sitting in Engelbart's office, and he has an office at Logitech, which is fitting, right? Because he's sitting in a company that in some sense, or in a very direct sense, is created because of his innovations, right? Logitech, an interaction company, and he's sitting there at this conference table, and over one shoulder, he's got a picture of him shaking hands with the President of the United States. Over the other shoulder, there's a certificate about this big that's the National Medal of Technology that he's won. And so all these signs of accomplishment in and around him. And he has this to say, I actually feel like a failure. The whole world seems to change. Oh, I know a lot have changed. The weather's changed a lot too. And it was startling to us, I think at the time, to hear him call what he had done a failure. But you have to realize, compared to what he intended to achieve, he fell short. Bob Taylor, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this is the claim that this whole conference is kind of geared around. Bob Taylor was the seed of that. He says, people tell me the internet happened fast. They're crazy. It took forever. And his primary claim is that stewards got in the way, right? That they couldn't see the value. The problem is that, as he states it, he thinks, Bob Taylor thinks mostly the stewards are clueless, right? And if they hadn't been, we would have had the web in 1985 or something like that, maybe even sooner. But I think if we're fair in summarizing the problem, that sometimes out of control workers know best, sometimes they don't. One more thing. There's this issue that floats around in here about control. right? And it's all about how we control these kind of out-of-control resources. Alan Kay argues, and this is an interesting hypothesis we may want to take up and discuss, he says business would rather control mediocre people than be out of control with talented people. And I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on that. Engelbart said, profit-oriented business people shot me down again and again. They said, you don't understand the market. These guys, when they say these things, they are not philosophical, sitting back and observing with dispassionately. They are still bitter. They are still mad about this. And you can see it. Fierce antipathy towards business. Engelbart at one point says the dumb jerks, right? Taylor said, I hate business. I wouldn't want to do it for a day. He said, that's why I never started a company. Kay says, business world is run by C++s.
That was before HP laid him off last month.
Well, and the rest of that quote says, one of the reasons I really liked working at Xerox PARC and ARPA is because I was always working with A+. So you see this attitude, which is not a small matter. So let me just sort of stop there, and I'm going to toss some general questions up, which I think are fall pretty obviously out of this. Is somebody can see the future. As Dick said, the technology is probably already here that's going to lead to the next big thing. Today, somebody can see the future quite clearly, perhaps somebody in this room. How do we recognize these people and the value of their vision when we encounter them? This is related to your question of it's not where we expect it. The steward-creator difference seems like one that's going to persist. Are there ways of working that can help us overcome the differences? And I wonder if the technologies themselves might be able to help us manage these things. So at this point, I think I want to open it up to you guys. And
I'll start. I think the paper that was the subject of this discussion is going to be standard required reading when we sit down and talk with an entrepreneur or research faculty that thinks they want to start a company. Because I think in the essence, the best I think is just communication. There's something in the mind of this person that is on the cusp of inventing something. And usually it's technology, not a product, and the technology speaks to the hope of a product that we think we have a shared vision of. And even that's not clear. I mean, we have an instant company right now that there were actually three groups. There's creators, super creators, and then stewards. And the super creator, before he left and discussed, said, all you guys want to do is make a product and increase your stock value. We said, well, yeah, duh.
Well, I just heard somebody say, duh, over here, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it was that sort of divisiveness. And then the creators, for their part, we will sell no wine before it's time. And in this case, it was a very technical piece of equipment. And there are reasons that has to be true. I mean, when you send it out to your customer, the mean time between failure has to be something north of 5 hours. But on the other hand, this concept of we don't want just a good wine, we want a perfect wine. There's got to be communication, and I don't know the answer because the engineers took over and half of the VCs left, including us. The two VCs that remained with the company happen to have PhDs in that area. And maybe they're right, maybe they're not. But
there's a monitoring issue, isn't there? I mean, you said the two. This is interesting. You said the guys that stayed had PhDs in that area. The suggestion being, I think, that they can see into the chaos better or something. Is that?
That would be the kindest interpretation. The people truly are brilliant. They, at the time, several years ago, when we first started the company, were way ahead of the competition. The window is closing, though, on that competitive advantage. And the fact that there's been engineering and re-engineering as opposed to let's get out a product, let's manage the expectations of the customer so that our reputations aren't damaged, that wasn't done. In the meantime, of course, time is money. The company's burned through a lot of money. Other competing technologies have come up, so on and so forth.
I sort of look at it and say, is the idea aligned with long-term trends, just things that are going to happen? As Ed so pointedly made, every company, and I was at Microsoft at the time, thought they could own a part of the internet. AOL proprietary protocol, Microsoft proprietary protocol, Prodigy at the time proprietary, and they just couldn't countermand that long-term trend. And at one point it became obvious that TCP/IP and HTTP and all the derivatives thereof were going to win. So is an idea aligned with long-term trends that are bigger than any given organization? It is also essentially the essence to a great fast follower plan, how to unseat an incumbent if you can be aligned with some trends that are much bigger than them. The second thing, and I think there's also a business trend, which I spend a lot of time thinking about, which is computing is enabling business decision makers to own the business process. That is the business interpretation of from the mainframe to client server now to web services. That is why Salesforce.com is doing well. It is because a business decision maker, in this case a sales professional, can start a process and not be beholden to somebody at the central office implementing an insanely complicated client-server implementation. So I kind of look at things, and then the third gate is, does it intuitively make sense? Can you see it in the customer? So that's the first overlay I put on top of something. The second observation, in a big company, I used to always say, Microsoft by and large is right on trends and wrong on timing. Windows got a Windows NT, formerly Landman, which Peter has some history. I mean, you were some brutal periods of time and years of shaming by annoying people from California. But ultimately, they were right? I mean, their timing was off. A startup doesn't have that luxury. A great saying in our business is, being early is the same as being wrong. Exchange, probably $500 to $750 million went into Exchange. That is not a venture fundable proposition. It's great that Microsoft could do it, but no startup in their right mind could make that level of investment. So the tricky thing within startups is that you have this tension between the need for immediate market engagement and this desire that you want to do a market risk disruptive technology. And those two things are at incredible tension.
Let me just do a check here. One of the things that we're asking ourselves is, how does innovation get accelerated? That's kind of at the root of this.
Yep.
And so I guess one observation I would throw out there that I bet you everybody will agree with is that one of the worst places for innovation to really happen is in large hierarchical organizations. It can crank and grind, it can come early, it can come late, it can come too big, there's all kinds of problems inherent, and it's a lot about stewards, and it's a lot about the wars between stewards and creators. And by the way, I think there's a whole bunch of subspecies that may be worth noting, but those are two ends of the spectrum. But the really hot innovations come from unexpected places, from kind of flat organizations. You look at Google, the huge impact that they had happened before they started spending lots of money. And now they're going to spend billions and do little incremental things. So, it's kind of interesting to think about spreadsheets and how those happened. No corporation at the high end said, we're going to make spreadsheet kind of disciplines happen throughout our company. It kind of happened from the bottom up. Mm-hmm. So, I think there's a lot of interesting things to think about.
And if you're saying, what you're saying in some senses, it's the stewards aren't necessarily the ones that know about it.
Yeah. Actually, the stewards are the last ones to know about it, usually. And actually, the creators are not necessarily even on the track that is generating the results. Mm-hmm. So, they happen spontaneously.
So you got some guys that don't have the ideas, you got other guys that have the ideas but are going in the wrong direction, and out of that you got to wrestle something together.
Something happens serendipitously in between the two.
Karen?
Well, I'll pull together with the project management perspective again, and I'd like to kind of tie some things together and maybe pose a question that some of you are thinking about or would like to address in the further discussion. But the first one has to do with the whole notion of conflict, which is coming up a lot in this discussion. The innovators have one perspective, the stewards have another perspective, and that conflict seems to persist throughout the project. In looking at what makes for effective project management, I'm thinking more and more that the earlier the conflict can be addressed, the better, and that we don't spend enough time in our projects in that early initiation stage working out the conflict. A colleague here at the University of Washington and I, Ted Clasterin, did a study a few years ago where we looked at, it was a simulated project on a computer, but we wanted to see what were the characteristics of the teams that ultimately were the most successful. And we found that these MBA student teams that were the most successful ultimately in this computer simulated project were the ones who had conflict in the first week. And so that really told us something about how if we don't have conflict early, it's just going to resurface and resurface, and if we address it early, we're probably better off. And then I was just reading Fortune magazine, a story about Samsung and how it has created this dormitory where all projects begin, and the people on that project live in that dormitory for 2 weeks or more, sometimes up to months. They live there and work there, and it's an interdisciplinary team. And until just the major foundational things are worked out, those people don't go home. So just food for thought about when we address the conflicts. Yeah.
So does this say, I mean, one of the things a project manager, a CEO at a startup or something might do is go out and start fights, start them early.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yeah. Because usually the basis of the fight is something very fundamental to the project, like why are we doing this? And very often in a project, there are different people with different ideas about why we're doing it. Let's address that now at the dormitory.
So pick a fight early
Yeah.
is a general
Yeah.
principle we might be able to. Ron, you had a thought? Yeah.
There's a real difference, though, between argumentative discourse and quarreling, between rational and irrational behavior. And in at least the one instance that's sitting so high in my mind, there's this, you need to bring in the psychologist, because I think there's this victim-victimizer behavior going on. And once a person goes victim, whether they're empowered or not, they don't think the rules apply to them. And therefore we can have behavior which is, subversive, or we can torpedo other ideas, or we can have this passive-aggressive. You better outline the differences in personality early. You better talk about them. And I certainly don't know if that's going to be the cure, but it's my best hope.
I want to thank our panelists.